this whole debate within the APA and the role of psychologists as you see it?
Yeah, Amy, we can put this in a wider context. The psychologists are critical, but they're critical because psychological torture is, in effect, enshrined within U.S. law. When the United States finally ratified the UN Convention Against Torture in 1994, we did so subject to certain qualifications known in diplomatic parlance as reservations. And basically, the 4 reservations that we introduced modified our approval, our ratification of that convention, everything in it except we redefined the UN definition of what torture was, extreme pain, and we called it prolonged mental harm. That for an act to rise to the level of torture, it had to become, in U.S. parlance, in those reservations, prolonged mental harm. Now, those 3 words are critical. First of all, mental. That meant that the United States was effectively splitting the UN Convention down the middle. The convention barred both physical and psychological torture. We were saying we accept the ban on physical torture, but we're exempting the ban on psychological torture. And we are qualifying that ban because in order for an act to rise to the level of torture, of psychological torture, it has to inflict prolonged mental harm upon the victim. Now, what is prolonged? How long is prolonged? That's not defined. It's a huge loophole. And what constitutes harm? That's another huge loophole. And that, of course, opened the door for that notorious memo by the Office of Legal Counsel, its leader then, Jay Bybee, to say that for something to rise to the level of harm, the pain must be sufficient or equivalent to organ failure. In other words, torture, psychological torture, up to, but not including death, is legally acceptable in U.S. law. Those words in the reservations have been replicated verbatim in the U.S. War Crimes Act of 1996, the Military Commissions Act 2006, verbatim. Those paragraphs recur in U.S. law, and it's that which creates the opening for psychologists like Mitchell and Jessen to participate in these programs, and that, in effect, means that these acts which are outrageous and which we now consider to be torture are, in fact, can be, if you will, can be exempted from the rubric of law. So it's a problem that the United States has been so reliant on psychological torture for so long that it's become embedded not only in bureaucracy, in professional practice, like the military psychologists that work for the Defense Department, but also in U.S. law. It's deeply embedded in our society.
I just wanted to make a slight correction. I was talking about Dr. Larry James. He's at Wright State in Dayton, Ohio. Aaron?
Well, yeah, just back to this history, Professor McCoy, that you're talking about. This raises an important point. A common narrative is that it's the Bush administration that imposed torture, but you're saying that this has been enshrined in policy for a long time.
Yes, I mean, again, going back to the start of this whole process, right? The United States responded to the idea that the Soviets had cracked the code of human consciousness, that they had somehow had the capacity to produce a Manchurian candidate. They could program an assassin. So we reacted to this by using psychologists to develop our own offensive doctrine of psychological torture. And again, the CIA disseminated this among our allies worldwide for 30 years throughout the Cold War. This became encoded with the U.S. military through the SERE training. And then when that was all over and it was time for serious structural reforms, those reforms took place. The CIA abjured torture in 1989, said they wouldn't do it anymore. They said it was completely counterproductive. The Defense Department recalled the manuals. The manuals were actually published in the U.S. press in 1997. It seemed to be all over, except that the inclination, the reliance, the belief in the faith in the efficacy of psychological torture was by this point so deeply embedded in the U.S. national security bureaucracy that our reflex upon ratification of the UN Convention, which, by the way, took us an extraordinarily long time, took us 6 or 7 years after the rest of the world had ratified that convention, By the time we did it in a way that protected, that reserved our right to engage in these psychological torture practices. And indeed, since then, we've conducted ourselves in activities that are a clear violation of the UN Convention. So, in other words, the reflex to torture, the sense of empowerment, the idea that we can defy international law, defy our own law for reasons of national security, that arises from this long and troubled history of our relationship to psychological torture.